First up today, though, we're talking audience. What are our listeners? Who are they? Why are they coming? What do we know about them? Do we know anything about them, or are we just stabbing in the dark? Every year, the ABC runs a podcast survey to give us data. How about data? How about information to better track our understanding of podcasts and listenership and who's turning up? And each year, we ask James Cridland to announce the results. It's kind of like an OzPod exclusive, and I'm a big fan of exclusives, so I'm very excited about this. James is the editor of podnews.net. It's the free daily newsletter for podcasting. He calls himself a radio futurologist, which is a very fancy title, which I would love to have for myself. Please welcome James to the stage to tell us who listens to us.
Well, good morning, everybody. Gosh, lots of people here, and it's wonderful to be back here in OzPod. As you've heard, I'm the editor of podnews.net, and I also do call myself a radio futurologist. Here's a tip: if you print your own business cards, you too can call yourself a stupid name. That's absolutely fine. Anyway, it's great to be here in Melbourne. Melbourne's a place for reinvention. Other cities would just admit that they had a problem with graffiti, but Melbourne, you don't have a problem with graffiti, you have a tourist attraction, which is very clever. Other cities would be slightly embarrassed that they can only manage a bus to the airport, but oh no, Melbourne has a sky bus. Take the sky bus. Anyway, I'm here to give you some sort of idea of where the podcast industry is going and who our audience is, what's going on with them. There's lots of research to point to here, both here at home in Australia and also overseas. So I'd like to put some of the data that we see today in international context as well. And as you just heard this morning, there's some new research too from the ABC. I'd just like to say the ABC, I think, should be commended for their continuing encouragement of this industry and all of the creative organisations of Australia. Media is changing fast, but a rising tide gathers all boats. And by being generous with its research and resources, the ABC benefits all of Australian podcasting. So thank you to them for this day. So let's get to the big numbers. These are the biggest numbers. They're from the ABC Corporate Tracking Research, which is a representative sample of online adult Australians. And the biggest number of all is this one. 91% of Australians aged 18 to 75 have heard of podcasting. 91%. And this is a new high. And other research conducted here supports that the vast majority of Australians have heard of podcasting, and this is a great result. And I think partially this is marketing of podcasts through the ABC, like this, or marketing of great podcasts from newspapers, for example, like this from The Australian. All help get the term podcasting out there. Now, let's be honest, if you have heard of podcasting, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know what a podcast actually is or how it works. I mean, I've heard of AFL, but I don't know what AFL is. My girlfriend tells me it's the one with the sleeveless tops and the short shorts, which is weird because I didn't think she was into sport. Anyway, that aside, this is good news. Many Australians have heard of podcasting, but how many Australians are consuming podcasting? Well, 62% of Australians have ever listened to a podcast. And that figure, again, is up from last year. And a third of all Australians are consuming podcasts every month. And that figure is up from 29% last year. So a nice increase there. By the way, that's a photograph of the best city in Australia. Now, I've looked at a lot of research. What's really good is that they all show signs of growth. This is different research. This is from Nova Entertainment and Ipsos. And they say that 20% of Australian podcast consumers are new and only started listening less than 6 months or so ago. Now, what might be happening here is that the type of people consuming podcasts are changing, because we're seeing this data elsewhere as well. This is data from Canada, showing that podcast consumption there is growing, but there are a lot of new people consuming podcasts there as well. But it's also worth putting this into context because podcasting is still a small amount of the total audio that Australians listen to. I've seen similar figures like this from the US, Canada, the UK. There's nothing special here about Australia. So podcasting has come far, but goodness, we've got a long way to go, which is great news, I think. There's clearly change and growth in podcasting. So where is that growth coming from? So for that and the rest of today, I'm going to talk about a different piece of ABC research. This is an ABC survey of 2,500 podcast consumers, obviously all online. And from that data, the growth is coming from women. 65% of women say that they are listening to more podcasters, and 35 to 54-year-olds are the fastest growing segment in the ABC survey this year. And again, we're not alone. This growth isn't just an Australian thing. Here's data from the US showing that women, and 35 to 49-year-olds in this case, are the fastest growing segments of the US podcast consumption. And the longer you've been listening, the more podcasts you listen to as well. Here's some Canadian data showing that. There are obviously a couple of different opportunities there. Getting more people listening to podcasts is one opportunity, of course, but also introducing podcast consumers to more podcasts that they really like is a very important part of where the growth is going to come from. So, how are people listening? How do people actually consume podcasting? Well, the ABC Podcast Survey says that podcast consumption is mainly done alone. 79%, nearly 80% of podcasts were listened to alone. And you can see roughly similar data here from the UK. And the UK survey also asked who else you listened with. And it's no surprise that partners, children, or other family members are the people you're most likely to share your podcasts with. By the way, only 50% of radio is listened to alone. So it's a big difference between radio and podcasting. And as you might guess, therefore, we mostly use headphones. 60% of podcast listening is on headphones, according to Nova's research. And again, by the way, radio is much less. 76% of all radio consumed is on a speaker. So podcasting is much more intimate than radio is. Now, I stood here last year talking about smart speakers. And I said, are they a thing for podcasting? And this is my slide from last year. And I said, no, they are not a thing from podcasting. So let's see how wrong I was. Because here's some data from the ABC. 31% of Australians who own a smart speaker claim to have asked to listen to a podcast. And they regularly do that, 31%. Now, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Here's another piece of data from the ABC, which shows the device that we most use to listen to podcasts. 74% of us most use our smartphone. Only 1% of us most use our smart speaker. So maybe smart speakers aren't the future. Maybe smart speakers are bigger in the US. After all, they've had them for rather longer. So this is global data from Libsyn, which is a podcast host based there. And they say that 86.6% of all downloads are to mobile devices. And for smart speakers, 0.12%. Maybe this is because speakers are in shared spaces, not in individual spaces. Maybe we don't want to share our podcasts with other people. Maybe voice recognition on smart speakers for podcasting is still actually really difficult and hard. Now, there is an exception to this. If your podcast is able to be used as a daily briefing, so you consume it along with the news every morning, then your figures can be really quite high. Now, it would be churlish for me to mention that Pod News is available as a smart speaker news briefing, so clearly I'm not going to mention that. Anyway, smart speakers, are they a thing for podcasting? Still no, I think. Not yet anyway. But smartphones then, Apple or Android? Well, in Australia, the market is clearly 60% Apple-ish, 40% Android, or so on. We like toy phones in this country, which is a lovely thing. But globally, it's very different, as you can see. Nearly 80% of smartphones sold are Android. But only 16% of all podcast downloads are to Android phones. If only this conference had someone from Google speaking at it who was going to tell us what they're going to do about all of that. Here are the apps being used. The most popular app, of course, is still Apple iTunes and podcasts with 64.3% of all downloads. Would anybody like to guess what the second most popular app is? There's a clue with the colour here. Spotify. It is. 7.2% of all podcasts downloaded are with Spotify. As of last week, anyone can be on Spotify. Just go to podcasters.spotify.com, fill in a form. You'll be there in half an hour. Here are the rest. You can see that I had a very sheltered school existence. Castbox, Overcast, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Adelaide's Pocket Casts, woo! And Google Podcasts is the number 8 podcast app. Number 8 podcast app sounds really big. 0.64% of all downloads sounds really small. If only there was somebody from Google speaking at this conference who would be able to tell us what they're going to do about it. So my advice here is that Android is a real opportunity, and ownership here in Australia is very equal. So give equal prominence to Android listeners as well as Apple podcast listeners. I'm a bit bored of seeing lots of press releases and lots of communication from podcasters linking through to iTunes. It doesn't work on an Android phone. I have an Android phone. It's pointless. So please don't annoy half of your audience and make sure that you're linking through to Google Podcasts as well, which, by the way, is pre-installed on every Android phone. Where are they listening? Well, they're listening at home. This is what my home looks like. Currently, I have a new dog. And also out and about. Lots of listening at home, obviously, reminds us that the Germans have it right. They call this thing a handy. They don't call it a smartphone or a mobile phone, because actually it's not necessarily used in a mobile environment. It's just handy to us, which I think is useful. This graph from the US is interesting as well, since it shows what people listen to in a car or in a truck because they're American. And when I saw this slide, I asked Larry Rosin, who runs Edison Research, I said, but where's podcasting here? And he said, well, podcasting is in the 4% of other, and it's not even all of that other. He says that it's very small, and that podcast listening is very hard in the car still. It's much easier to use the radio in the car, and that's why the radio does so well. It's something that maybe the OEMs in this room might be able to help us with. Finally, opportunities for growth. At least 9 out of 10 people listen to radio every week, but they don't all listen to podcasts. So why not? This is a piece of really interesting research from the US by Jacobs Media. It is talking only to radio fans, people who listen to the radio and love the radio. And the number 3, I don't have time, can't do very much about that. Number 2, I don't know how. And I think we worry about the number 2 rather more than we worry about the number 1. I don't know why. If we can communicate why people should be listening to podcasts, all of the wonderful content which is out there and everything else, I think that growth will surely follow from that. Tom Webster from Edison Research, he likes showing the TV schedules and saying it's full of crap, but it's quality crap. And you should be making lots of quality crap in terms of podcasting, stuff that people want. And you can see here some of the big shows in the US. The Voice, I've heard of that. FBI, no idea. The OT, who knows? Young Sheldon, I don't know. Anyway, the good news is that we're better than that in Australia, because when you look at what people watch on the TV, they watch an awful lot of news and an awful lot of documentaries and an awful lot of much more in-depth stuff. You'll see the ABC News in there. You'll see the excellent 7:30. I learnt that Lee Sales is from Brisbane, the best city in Australia, earlier on. So, so I think that that's helpful and useful in terms of what type of content that we should be making. But I wonder whether bookshops actually are secret here. Because when you use a book, you're consuming that alone, just like a podcast. You go into a bookshop and all of the books are arranged in sections like business and self-help and history and biography, all the things that work in terms of podcasting. And of course, true crime. In fact, the biggest selling genre in books is crime now. Isn't that interesting? And there's good news. Australians are happy to try new things. The ABC podcast survey says that 29% of respondents listened to a new podcast series in the last week. And that, I think, is really good. How do they choose it? They choose it by episode description, so what's in the actual write-up, and by recommendation. So brands and your host is slightly less important. Really interesting. Also really interesting, 64% don't care whether it's an Australian podcast or not. Great content is great content, wherever it comes from. So cross-promotion of podcasts is therefore an important part of podcasting's growth. Being in a podcast network is probably a good plan because that enables more cross-promotion opportunities. But overall, make great stuff because great content makes for great podcasts. There's plenty more data from the ABC podcast survey, which you'll find online at the ABC this morning and linked to from podnews.net tonight, and lots of data from the rest of the world, which I'll also share. So thank you for your time. Have a great day today. Thank you.